acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we gather this evening. We pay respects to the Lenape peoples, past, present, and future. This year's summit, titled Speaking Truth, celebrates 10 years of the Creative Time Summit. I am thrilled to welcome you to the first of 3 discussions. Tonight, Speaking Truth, Media and Technology. On June 25th, Speaking Truth, Economics and Sovereignty. And on September 26th, Speaking Truth, Health and Gender. These 3 talks serve as a precursor to our multi-day convening taking place November 14th through 16th. Tonight's program will be presented with ASL and real-time captioning. Thank you to our speakers, Morehshin Allahyari, artist, activist, educator, and curator, whose work addresses the political, social, and cultural contradictions we face daily. Tega Brain, artist making dysfunctional devices, eccentric infrastructures, and experimental information systems, and our moderator for tonight, Amy Goodman, of Democracy Now! She is an investigative broadcast journalist, syndicated columnist, and author. Amy opened our first Creative Time Summit in 2009, and it feels fitting that she's joining us tonight for our first summit event celebrating our 10-year anniversary. Tonight, we pose the question, in a moment of historically low trust in institutions, including the media, what work is being done to forge meaningful connections and solidarity structures? How are artists and activists embracing new media and proliferating technologies to conceive of challenges to conventional wisdom? I'd like to thank everyone involved in making this year's summit possible, with major support for the 2019 Creative Time Summit provided by the Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation and the Trust for Mutual Understanding. Our hotel partners, Sister City, and of course, New Lab, our host and in-kind venue supporter for Speaking Truth, Media, and Technology. As always, a huge thank you to the Creative Time team for making tonight happen. And it is my pleasure now to introduce Sean Stewart, CEO of New Lab. Sean, thank you for hosting us tonight at New Lab. It is a thoughtful partnership and no accident that we are holding this conversation in a venue that is at the forefront of scaling frontier technologies and supporting the work of other creatives and technologists like the ones we will be welcoming on this stage tonight. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks so much, Justine. That was very kind. As you're here for the night in our house, I just wanted to welcome you to our home. We opened New Lab 2.5 years ago with about 100 people here, a community of artists in residence, technologists, entrepreneurs, and some resident academics. Today, there's over 600 people who come here every day across all 4 of those categories. And we're thrilled to have kept the creative relationship alive as we focus on technology, media, as well as the artist community based here at New Lab. So on behalf of the New Lab team, we want to thank Justine and everybody involved in bringing this event to our community, because we value your time and having you here tonight, and we hope the panel goes incredibly well. And with that, I'd love to welcome Amy to the stage to bring on her panel. Thank you.
It's a great honor to be here. What a remarkable space this is. And to spend this time with you this next hour and a half. We're going to start off by hearing from each of our speakers, these remarkable artists, activists, then have a conversation, and then open the discussion up to you. And we're going to begin with Morehshin.
Hello, thanks for being here. It's such an honor to be part of Creative Time and also finally see New Lab. I've been told so many times the past years that I've been here to come and visit, and here it is, it finally happened organically. So our talks are supposed to be super short, and there are very limited number of slides. So I think for the sake of that, I am going to focus today on three main projects that perhaps during this panel we'll get a chance to talk about more in details. In all of these projects, I use digital fabrication as a tool for resistance, activism, and reimagining the possibilities of the past, present, and future with a focus on non-binary relationship between history and technology. How can we use technology as a tool for political resistance, for personal and collective storytelling, for defining space and opening up potential? A position for outside that asks difficult questions and suggests alternative methods. So one of the projects that I started to work on since 2015 is this project. It's called Material Speculation ISIS. And it's a digital fabrication and 3D printing project that inspects the political and poetic relationship between 3D printing, plastic, oil, techno-capitalism, and jihad. In this project, I use 3D modeling and 3D printing as tools to reconstruct 12 selected artifacts that were destroyed by ISIS in 2015 at Mosul Museum. Some of you perhaps might remember the video that went viral at that time, showing the destruction of the artifacts. But in addition to doing this kind of like remodeling and reconstruction work, because the research aspect of this project was very intense, it took a long time to gather material, to bring different resources together in terms of not only what was destroyed and what was original that was destroyed, but also information about the artifacts themselves, and also the process of recreating them, remodeling them. And so because the research aspect of this work was so important to the creating of it, inside each of these artifacts, I have embedded or included basically memory cards and flash drives that contain all this research material, from PDF files to images, to my email correspondence with historians and scholars, as well as OBJ STL files. So these are standard 3D printing files, meaning that if anyone has access to these files, they can recreate them, they can 3D print the models. But also at this point, I was really thinking about this work, these sculptures as time capsules, how to keep this information for future civilizations. There is a lot more to like really sort of like reflect back on this work, because when I was making it, the focus was very much on reconstructing these works that were destroyed by ISIS. But as I also started to get more interested in ideas around reconstruction, using 3D printing, 3D scanning as tools for reconstruction, I also started to realize that there are a lot of like issues in relationship to a lot of tech companies, a lot of them based in Europe or the US, who do these kind of reconstruction works, and a lot of them also like based in Silicon Valley, and sort of the kind of violence that goes into that. When we see ISIS destroying these artifacts, they are reclaiming some kind of history through destruction, through absence, right? But then a lot of these Western archaeology or like Silicon Valley companies who are doing these reconstruction work, they're reclaiming again some kind of history through sort of like a presence that I find also problematic. There's a lot to discuss in here, which is a term I've coined called digital colonialism. Hopefully we'll have more time during Q&A to talk about that. The second project is a project called Additivism, which I also worked on from 2014 to 2017 in collaboration with artist and writer Daniel Rourke. The term additivism is a combination of the two words additive and activism. So additive technologies, again, like 3D printing, or even processes like weaving or knitting, right? You can think about that as an additive process versus a subtractive process. Let's say carving or subtracting. But we were really interested in thinking about additive process in relationship to activism, in relationship to thinking critically about these digital tools that are being used in a lot of fab labs, in a lot of maker spaces, but
a lot of time they're not used in a critical way, sort of unfolding or like rethinking the potential of these machines that get used, but they have a lot of possibilities in terms of being used as tools for resistance, as tools for activism, as ways of like science fictional future thinking. So the machine, this 3D printer, became our point of departure for writing a manifesto called the 3D Activist Manifesto, and then a cookbook called the 3D Activist Cookbook, which is an imaginative, provocative work of over 100 award-winning artists, activists, and theorists that we gathered within 2 years and then edited. The 3D Activist Cookbook is online, it's available, so is the manifesto. So if you're interested, you can spend time with this work. It contains OBJ and STL files, critical and fictional texts, recipes, impractical and practical designs, and methodologies for living in this most contradictory of times. The last project is a project called She Who Sees the Unknown, which is an in-progress long-term project, research-based project, that I started to work on in 2016 as my artist residency at IBM. In She Who Sees the Unknown, I used 3D modeling, 3D scanning, 3D printing, and storytelling to recreate monstrous female/queer figures of Middle East origin, using the traditions and myth associated with them to explore the catastrophes of colonialism, patriarchism, and environmental degradation in relationship to the Middle East. One of the main terms that I have also developed in relationship to this work is refiguring or refiguration. Refiguring as a feminist and activist practice, refiguring as a way to go back and to reimagining the past, reimagine different possibilities of the present and the future. In addition to this kind of work that I do, and also with She Who Sees the Unknown, I'm also really interested to think about refiguring and also art making as a practice that can go beyond the problems of the art world and also the walls of the gallery. So how you can actually build community, how you can create platforms and invite other people to be part of the kind of work that you're doing, and sort of like not think about it only as something that can be a solo practice. So I also, through a lot of the kind of work that I do, we can go to the next slide, I invite different artists, activists, scientists, etc. A lot of time, focusing on people from the Middle East or women to like discuss different notions of this like research that I want to that I'm working on. This is an event called Refiguring, which was at IBM. And in it, we, again, like came to this idea of refiguring from, a science point of view, from a designer point of view, from an artist point of view. So, for now, I'm just gonna give you this much information, and hopefully, through our panel, we can discuss some of this more. Thank you.
I'll pry the rest out of you later.
This event, but I can't see myself in there. Outside of the frame. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to share the stage with you both. I'm such a fan of all your work. So really looking forward to talking afterwards. But yeah, I've also prepared just a few minutes about some recent work that I've been doing. And I think I'll start with the story of Enron. So you are probably familiar with the story of Enron. In about 2003, it was revealed that there was sort of spectacular amounts of corruption going on within this corporation. And the Federal Energy Commission was in the process of sort of shutting them down and going through all of their records. And in this process, a really kind of strange thing happened, where all of the emails that were on the Enron servers that had been sent between sort of 158 or so executives were sort of put together as a corpus, and the FERC decided to release them online, making them publicly available.
And what they did was they created the first sort of publicly available archive of like 1.5 million emails that was thought to be representative of what real communication looked like. And so this is, before Google, before these sort of big companies were collecting emails as they are today. And so the Enron Email Archive became this really important resource in computer science to build natural language systems. So systems like Siri, it was used in the early days of Siri. It was used to train spam filters. The question of like, how do you tell what is spam? It was thought that through the archive, this would become much easier. And so in 2015, I worked in collaboration with Sam Levine, who's in the front there, and we created this project called The Good Life. And The Good Life allows you to sign up and receive all 500,000 emails that are in the Enron Email Archive. And you can choose to, originally, we had a 30-day plan, so you could receive 500,000 emails in 30 days, but Google shut us down. And so now, actually, we have a 7-year plan, or a 14, or a 28-year plan. And the project does two things. So if you were to sign up to this service, you get to experience like the demise of an empire from the inside and see all the sorts of banal, corrupt, sometimes really sort of interesting, sometimes really boring correspondence of that corporation. But you also begin to realize that this is a very specific group of people sending email. They're mostly white, they're mostly male, they're working in Texas for an energy corporation, right? So the use of this archive as a representative corpus is problematic because it's not representative. It's a cultural object that contains all of the sort of context of where it came from. And so a lot of my work operates like this. It addresses computational technologies and how they sort of curate a reality in very specific ways. Armed with a computer, the world starts to seem like data. The world gets read as data, and then this data gets analysed as patterns. And in the context of artificial intelligence and machine learning, these patterns then get codified as algorithms or models of reality, and decisions get made with these things. And so I'm trying to situate my practice within these systems, and manipulate them, adapt them, try to sort of estrange the version of reality that they produce, and ask questions about where their limitations are and where they might break or not be appropriate. And could they sort of be imagined in other ways? These data-driven technologies that are also being used by companies like Google and Facebook in the context of the media. And another recent project comes out of a lot of research I was doing around targeted advertising and the use of algorithms to sort of curate content online. As you probably all know, everything we do online is tracked and data is collected in order to show us content that reflects sort of our past behaviours. And so in light of this next work was done in collaboration with New York Public Libraries. They did a series of commissions around privacy and surveillance, and so I ran a series of workshops with middle schoolers at the Bushwick Public Library, and the project was called Bushwick Analytica. And I invited them to develop their own target advertising campaigns and develop a message that they might want to target to a particular group of people. And so my group of participants came up with all sorts of messages. Some of them were responding to the sort of lack of environmental discourse in the US. Some were sort of making comments around the prevalent political issues. But I've chosen two here. Adam S. did a campaign around how he didn't want any school on Mondays, and he tried to pick a demographic of people who would be his teachers or his parents to try to convince them that this was a good idea. And then Michael wanted to do a campaign about how he should be able to have a dog, and he tried to target his parents in a 1 kilometre radius. And so we ran these ads on Google Ads in December, and of course the project kind of mobilizes questions around who we think these persuasive technologies are for, who gets to take advantage of them, and also the question if you, the project sort of responds to a hypothesis that if you really want to understand these tech companies and the logics by which they're operating through, the best way to do it is to try to use them as an advertiser, right? And then you start to see the categories and the ways that they're portraying their users. Do we have time for one more? We'll do one more. Okay, I think the next slide. Let's go to the next one after this. Next one. Okay, this one. So the final project I'll share with you is a project that addresses more specifically engineering and addresses the way we design systems. So how we're designing systems reflects obviously the sort of goals and assumptions of those who are building them. And so a lot of time in my practice too, I'm trying to see if I can design a system that we might, conventionally think would fail because it shows very much the logic by which it's operating. And so this final project was a series of Wi-Fi routers that I developed in a project called Being Radiotropic. And each Wi-Fi router kind of misbehaves or malfunctions in a particular way. So one of them, the one on the screen, is called an orbit, and it provides so its data speed and Wi-Fi strength is coupled with the orbit of the moon. So for one day a month you get really strong, fast internet, and for one day a month you'll get no internet, and for the 28-day cycle it sort of ebbs and flows. There was the second router in the series was a router that brings up the Wi-Fi network when you light a candle. And you blow that candle out and the network will disappear. And again, I'm interested in coupling network technologies with sort of environmental systems or environmental cycles, because these things usually get edited out with digital technologies. The final Wi-Fi router was controlled by a houseplant. The houseplant was able to take photos of itself and do an injection attack and put them in your web feed if you were on its network. Again, taking advantage of a sort of security vulnerability in the network, but putting it to the agenda of this non-human organism. And so, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I call these works eccentric engineering because we're sort of seeking another way to engineer and build systems around us.
Well, I have so many questions, and I'm sure you all do too, but I wanted to step back for a moment to learn about how each of you came into the art world and came here to the United States. Morehshin, as I was just learning about you, I couldn't help but think just this weekend about President Trump's tweet, who said, if Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran, as the United States beats the drums for war with Iran. And I'm wondering if you can talk about growing up in Iran, coming to this country, and what this kind of atmosphere is like for you as a woman artist, Iranian activist, working here in the United States.
So I guess I'll answer the first part of the question first, and which is my background coming into the art world. I started to become really interested in writing when I was 12, and I was also very close to my grandmother at that time, who lived with us in our house. My mom had, she was a flight attendant. My dad also traveled a lot, so they were not home a lot, and she sort of raised me. And she would always tell me a lot of stories like that. I feel like my love actually for storytelling so much comes from this oral, storytelling relationship that I had with her, where she would just tell me about her life, and she would also cry a lot. And
where did you live?
Where did I live? I lived in Tehran. My grandmother was Kurdish, so she grew up in Kurdistan, and then with my dad. They moved to Tehran. And so she passed away when I was 12, and then I was at the same time going to these creative writing classes, and I started to write a lot of stories about her. And the teacher I had was like, I think you should just make it all to like a long book about her life. So I wrote a 400 pages book from the age of 12 to 15, and it got published in Iran when I was 16. I got a lot of like prizes for it. And you know, for me, like literature became such an important thing in terms of like connecting to the world, understanding my emotions and ways of expressing different issues that I saw. You know, sometimes I read this book and I'm like, I'm such a weird child. Like, how did I like write this? But also, it's very dark, which is very weird. But because I was trying to tell her story and her struggles and things that she would tell me, and that was, now that I think about it, my way of trying to amplify a voice that I felt like was somehow invisible. And a lot of my art practice, I think, tries to do that, to make something that is invisible visible. You know, we often think about art and activism as something that has to like solve a problem, and I don't think that's an accurate definition of what it can do, right? Like if art activism, if this kind of like doing political work that is not just directly political, that it has poetics and concepts and, you know, can exist in like many other ways of being presented, you know, can be done sort of like in this way. I think that there's a lot of like power to it. Anyway, so then after that I studied media studies at Tehran University for my undergrad, and then I got a scholarship to come to University of Denver for my MA, which was in digital media art. And then your question now with like everything that is happening with Iran. So, you know, I think now I'm finally, after living in the US for 12 years.
How did you come to the US?
Through student visa. Yeah, so I had admission from university and I got full scholarship, and then I came to study for my master. But, you know, now I have my citizenship, but a lot of my friends, a lot of you know, other people who are also from these like banned countries now don't have their green card, or you know, they're on some visa that is like work visa or student visa. So it's been really, really difficult. I mean, it was difficult after 9/11, but the last years it's really been affecting the lives of so many people that live here in such real ways. Like I have friends who haven't seen their like parents for like 3.5 years. They can't leave, they can't come in. There are like sanctions happening in Iran, which is also again so real. It's like really influencing people's lives, and that, you know, one thing that people like talk about is that sanctions are basically soft war. So we already have gone through some kind of war, but also the problem with that is that it's very much invisible. You know, how many of you, I don't know, like follow news and know what's happening with like the economy in Iran right now and how it's influencing people's lives in a way that people can't afford like meat, people can't afford like things that are just like a daily thing. We're not even talking about anything fancy.
And what did it mean to you as a Muslim then? I mean, you were working here, you had a green card, but then you too were starting.
Yeah, I left for a festival called Transmedia in Berlin. And at the time, I had my Iranian passport and a green card, and the ban happened literally like a week after I left. And I was, you know, stuck for the first like a week or 10 days because at the beginning, if you might remember, the green card holders were also included, and there was a lot of confusion around what's going to happen. So everyone was like, just stay until like things get clear. There are people at airports that are like being turned around, or they're like getting like forced to like sign forms, etc. That would like, you know, have a bad influence on their you know, green card case that was in progress. So, you know, again, that was like so real. I felt like everything that I did here could just go back to zero, just like that, you know. But I had the privilege to come back because I had my green card. But again, I'm constantly in contact with like my friends who live here and are struggling, you know, with their visa. They can't get work visa and they can't make a living here. So I see even some of them in the audience, and it's a lot of things that are happening since the last like 3 years. But then the war beats again. I don't know. We're all also the children of war. Also, like we all grew up with like Iran-Iraq war. So I also feel part of us is just like, although it's all scary, but like, I don't know, I'm sometimes like, I feel numb to it. Like, my head doesn't have more room to like, think about this. Once it happens, I'll deal with it. But I don't know like, if I can like sit and think about it so much. So it's very, very, very difficult. I'm like blocking it in my head for now, although I like read all the news and stuff about what's happening. I tweet and Javad responds.
And say what the foreign minister of Iran's response was to President Trump saying basically, we will annihilate you.
Yeah, so because he was like, you know, Alexander the Great attacked Iran and he couldn't like remove this nation and our like, culture, you know. So we've been through a lot of things and a lot of similar things to you, and we will continue to survive this. So that was the response.
So Tega, you also come from a place that is in the news right now. You come from Australia. If you could talk about how you went from Australia to the United States, and also how you went from being an engineer to an artist in tech. It's so unusual for a woman.
I've been in the US coming on 6 years. Similarly to Morehshin, I came over on an education visa to do some work with a professor who was based in New York. And whilst after being here for a year, I got a job as a teaching at SUNY Purchase and stayed to pursue that. I think one of the things that I found here in New York too was that there was such a rich and vibrant like community working on art and technology, and so that has been really rich and sort of nourishing to be a part of. Prior to that time, I was in Australia. I did work and train as an environmental engineer, and worked for a number of years in the context of water engineering, in working in consulting. And I think I moved into the arts from that background because I found that a lot of the ways that problems or challenges get framed in engineering is through a sort of technocratic lens, right? The response is always framed as sort of like a technical challenge. And particularly working in the context of the environment, a lot of the issues we were facing, questions around land management, questions around risk and infrastructure, questions around resources and communities, resilience. A lot of these questions seem to be questions of politics and culture. What levels of risk are we comfortable with? How do we prioritize the needs of other species? How do we sort of build interspecies relationships into our environment? These are all questions that are very much contingent on the way we see ourselves in relation to the biosphere.
Which is also very interesting right now, given that the Conservative candidate it's really been a shock to Australia, has just won, Scott Morrison, promising very, very much in the Trump mold of
Business as usual.
and whereas the other candidate talked about climate change, his whole campaign is around coal and exploiting resources. These are your premise.
Yeah, it's been really disappointing, and I think everybody is quite shocked with the result. There's a lot of discussion around how conservative governments that run with that sort of draw attention to climate policies that might involve taxation or have economic ramifications. That seems to be a very successful platform to run on, and it seems that it has resulted in the Conservative Party returning to power.
And your country has a very interesting policy where you are required to vote.
That's right. It's compulsory.
And you are fined if you don't.
That's right. Yes, so
How much is the fine?
the fine is about $100. So yeah, it's compulsory to vote if you're over 18, and every school is set up as a voting place on election day, which is also on a Saturday. So
Here, if you attempt to vote and you're not have the proper status, you can go to jail.
Right.
There, you're required to vote or you will be fined. So talk about the second part, and this is for both of you, as women in the field of technology and art. You are so unusual.
I hope that's changing. I mean, obviously diversity is a huge issue in all sectors of technology and engineering. And I think when we talk about questions of representation in data sets, questions of the politics of the systems we're building, how can they possibly be representative of our populations if the people making them are such a narrow slice of the world? So I think that's why I'm working in this space.
I know you said, Morehshin, that people will sometimes say to you about your 3D art, your 3D reproductions, who actually does it? Thinking that you would be the one who actually
I mean, especially when I was
does
doing the collaboration in the Archival project, and I was doing a lot of like the 3D animation work and a lot of the work with the technology, 3D modeling, etc. And people would always assume that he is the one who's done the technical work. So whenever we would present together, they would always ask me the technical questions, like, how did you do that? What software did you use? And I'd be like, I have no idea. I'm actually more like of the writer. She's more of the tech person. So the fact that people still would assume that, right? That's something that happens constantly. And I also like, I think even though we might like have like reached a place where like there's like more and there's like more and more women who are like participating in these spaces, I think there's still definitely lack of representation for like women of color, especially when it comes to like Black women. When you look at like universities and face students in art and also like technology. So there's a long way to go. Can I tell you one of my favorite rants about technology and this whole like situation? So one thing I always like to tell my students when I like give talks at university is that I don't want to live in the future of Elon Musk. And people like usually look at me and like something like clicks in their head, or they're like, what does that mean? And I really think about that often, like how problematic it is that there's still these figures that tell us what it is that we should imagine for the future. And as long as those are the figures that are in power, I think we're always going to lack alternative imagination of the possibilities of what can be in the future, because you can never understand the struggle of like women of color or like people of color, etc. Right? It's going to always be some limitation in that future. And his solution to things would be, let's leave to go to Mars, and who's going to be able to have access to research to let's say go with him, and who's going to be left behind, right? Those are the serious questions when it comes to like race and class separation. And I think about that in a similar way with like technology and access to technology, which is still very like separated. There's a serious gap with developing countries. So yeah, all those are also realities.
So talk about digital colonialism, the term that you coined.
So that was a term that I started to sort of like use in my lecture in 2015, and it was specifically, when I was using it, I was like really thinking about the use of 3D scanners and 3D printers in relationship to reconstruction work that was being done in different countries in the Middle East or Africa, etc., where these, again, like Silicon Valley or like digital archaeology spaces, often like based in developed Western countries, would go to these countries that were in war or under conflict, or there was some kind of environmental disaster, and then they 3D scan these historical sites and these different like artifacts, etc. And then they come back with that data. They have ownership of that digital data, and copyright-wise, a lot of the research I've done around these places that are doing this kind of work, you can have either access to this digital data or the scan of these spaces, or if you want to use it it's for non-commercial use, which means they own the copyright. And then there's a lot. I mean, I just gave a 45-minute lecture only on this at New Museum some weeks ago. But you know, we also have these like issues of like white savior. We have all these issues of, again, the gap, the digital gap. These countries not having access to these technologies. So when you go to the Met, or you know, when you think about an example like the Nefertiti head, which is, you know, one of the Egyptian famous artifacts that was basically stolen from Egypt. There has been a lot of fights back and forth for like many years between the Egyptian government and the German government. The Egyptian government wants it back, and they're like, we're not going to give it back to you. You understand colonialism in that sense, right? Historical colonialism in that sense within objects. But with digital ownership of a lot of these like data that are being 3D scanned, there's still a lot of sort of like invisibility within the problem of this kind of work that is being done. And so, but you could extend this term, digital colonialism, to any kind of imbalance when it comes to access to technology, and like how there's like dominant access and influence for the Western developed countries compared to undeveloped countries.
Tega, can you talk about unfit?
I think there is a slide up there. Unfit Bit was a work that I made in response to a phenomena, again around 2015. I started to see ads in the subway that offered insurance discounts if you agreed to share your personal fitness data with the insurance company. And so in collaboration with Surya Martin, we made a project that developed ways that you could keep your data active, take advantage of these discounts, even if you didn't have the lifestyle to match. You know, maybe you're a taxi driver, or you didn't have time to go to the gym. So the project obviously points to, again, how narrow the view of these trackers are of health, how easy and flawed their view of the world can be. But it also shows, I think, like how powerful these data sets also are, and increasingly they're being used in the context of access to insurance, and in ways that really impact our lives in significant ways. So although these technologies are so like sort of ridiculous, they do have a lot of power. And I think, responding to one of the points you made, Morehshin, like this project's often talked about as an activist project, right? And at the time when we published it, we got a lot of responses on Twitter and so forth, going, good job, and every time there's some terrible like surveillance tracking technology in the news, this project comes up. And it worries me a little, because this is a story, right? It's rhetorical, it's telling us, it's trying to reframe the narrative through which tracking technologies are being marketed. It can't scale. Like, this isn't going to help us deal with surveillance and the way that personal data is being used. And I think that's an important point, right? We need regulation. US is one of the only countries that doesn't have like strong privacy regulations. Even China has a legal framework around this. So there's a lot of work still to be done, political work to make these changes.
So, in a few minutes, we're going to open up the discussion. But I wanted to ask you about the protests that have been going on at places like the Guggenheim, at the Whitney most recently on Friday. The demand that one of the board members, Warren Canders, leave the board of the Whitney because he is the CEO of Safariland, which makes tear gas and has been used against migrants on the border, used against Palestinians, used in various ways around the world. And at the Guggenheim, the artists who gathered there and dropped thousands of prescription-sized pieces of paper with messages against the Sandlers, who have funded so many museums around the world, because they say their money is blood money, come from Purdue Pharma, the fuel, the opioid epidemic. Talk about yourselves as artists and where the funding comes from to do art and what you think in situations like that. Morehshin.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, being an artist, it's always has also been about I have to take sides and be ethical and even like reflect back on something I did that I'm like, oh, I should like now try to like correct this one thing that I think was not what I thought the response would be, etc. So I always think about this stuff, and I have a big mouth, so I say a lot of things in a lot of places, and like I don't sell my material speculation work, although I sell like some of my other sculptures from other series, but those work to me are like not made for like commercial purpose, and that has been like a really like that this work has received so much press and attention, and like there's a lot around it, but for me, it was like, okay, I have to like make a decision that this work is not for sale. It's not. There's only one of it that I like 3D printed. I was living in San Francisco before I moved here, and I had like a person who approached me, and they're like, let's see if we can make like a bigger version of one of these sculptures. Maybe it can be in San Francisco. I was like, no, I don't see why San Francisco needs this work that was destroyed in Iraq. So the same thing, like just. And this is, again, very personal. I'm not trying to tell anyone else how they should deal with this. But for me, it's always been about, you have to have sides. And a lot of artists sometimes are like, oh, this is like political, or this is not related to us. And yeah, and I also like grew up in, growing up in Iran, I think politics is so embedded in your daily life. That's so many of my artist friends, most of my artist friends, they all make like work that is political. I think to actually not make this kind of work is because you perhaps have some kind of like privilege, right? That you don't have to even like worry about that. So you also sometimes need the space to actually not think politically, because then it can be too much. But in general, I'm really like proud of like people I know that are colleagues, that are friends, that are like doing this kind of protest, that are like standing and raising their concerns about these funders. So it can be challenging because like we're all hustlers, but at the same time, blood money, I don't know, it just doesn't work for me.
Tega.
Yeah, I think it's great that there has been institutions that have refused money from these people and are standing behind those decisions. I think we need to see more action like that. It is complicated, obviously, particularly in an arts funding model that exists here in the US. You often have to think carefully about what projects you'll do, what collaborations you'll do, where the funding is coming from. And I mean, in the tech art space, that often means collaborating or working with the companies that you are trying to critique. So it can get very complicated. And I think, obviously, it's a very personal decision, and it depends on a lot of things, like if you have terrible student loans, or if you have other sources of income and whatnot. So everybody, I think, has their own sort of set of values and ways they make that decision.
You did a very interesting project after Trump came into office around the NEA, when the Trump administration said they were going to zero out the National Endowment of Arts. Talk about your response.
I did a very simple project that simply was a website that visualized, that listed every project that the NEA had funded over the past years. And these are projects like, these are, funding community choirs and community theatres, and most of their funding actually happens, through the country in rural communities and not so much in the big city centres. And I guess the project was motivated from coming from Australia, where we actually have quite a well-funded public art entity, and as an artist one can apply to this to the Australian Council and get funding for specific projects. And obviously this doesn't exist in the US and it hasn't existed for some decades. And so I really wanted to just highlight how, it wasn't a partisan issue in any way. It's funding culture across the country. And I think if culture has to suddenly become commercially viable, if you always have to sell your works, sell tickets to your work, if there's no other mechanisms for organisations to get funding, then our culture will suffer. And there isn't the sort of freedom to do also the political work that we need so desperately.
Can you talk about how you see your art as related to each other?
It's a hard question.
Well, I think we both sort of do the kind of work that, like you mentioned, like it might not actually like end up solving a problem, but it exposes a problem, right? Your work definitely uses sort of like satire and different ways to like make these like objects or like ways of rethinking about situations, right? Through this like object making or these mechanisms you're creating. And I think my work is a bit more serious, although I also have some funny work, but the works I talked about is like more serious in that sense, but also like kind of tries to do a similar job of, again, that whole idea of making something that is invisible, expose a problem without...
Also, like reclaiming technologies.
Yeah.
Which is something I see very much in your process, where trying to pull them out of the narrative and the context that they're typically found.
Yeah, definitely. Reframing and also like we are both in the teachers and we're involved with like education, and I think that's something we also try really hard to teach our students in that sense, right? To like really rethink, because as soon as like you give access to like software technologies, a lot of times students can like think about it in this like very like one-dimensional way. So the critical thinking of technology classes are for that. That like, listen, we have access to these tools, but think about how you can actually unlearn what you think you know about them and like rethink about how you can use them. And that sometimes can be actually very powerful and magical to like see students doing that kind of work with technologies.
Morehshin, can you talk about what you're going to do tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock?
I'm going to Canada I have a solo show coming up, so yeah, catching a plane, yeah, to go do that, yeah.
And the project is?
She Who Sees the Unknown, which is the work that was the monstrous figures from the Middle East. So there'll be like installations. It's the first time actually I'm showing all the pieces like together with these installations. Some of these installations are things that I've been like dreaming about for like so long, and because of like not having enough access to funding, etc., like I'm building a blood pool, which was like not possible. So it's finally coming together, so I'm very excited about that.
Talk more about it and how you came up with the title, and more about what it means to present, like you're doing right now, going to Canada, to another country, and who you hope to reach.
Yeah, I mean, this work has a lot of different components. So one is creating these like objects, installations. I think about them sort of as like building shrines. So I have like a selection of these like 4 Gen or Genie figures so far. They have their different stories, and I create from like these like old ancient sort of illustrations of them. I reappropriated and create 3D model and then create sculptures from them. And again, put them in environments that, as the audience enters, have some kind of like emotional connection to that, or like again a shrine-like connection to that work. And then I also make videos, text-based work, a VR piece, a net art piece. So each work has its own sort of visual component based on what makes sense with that very specific figure. And I'm also creating an archive of these figures, which doesn't currently exist. We really don't have an archive that has this kind of like focus on monstrous female figures from the Middle East. And then this.
And what made you think about this? Monstrous female figures?
So, reading a lot of Donna Haraway and Rosie Braidotti, which some of you might know, the Cyborg Manifesto, etc. And I was like, what is our version of this like monstrous cyborg that can be powerful? And then I remember I was like reading some stories about like these like old histories, but also like superheroes, right? Like how you think about growing up in Iran, also here, how you think about superheroes, and it's always like male figures that can win all the battles and do this and that. We have so many of those growing up in Iran. I'm like, where are the female figures? I'm sure there are more of what we don't know. So that was also important for me because I wanted to take them out of these forgotten, misrepresented contexts and then bring them out. And also this concept of embracing the monstrosity. When you think about like witches or like these kind of figures, I mean in the Western tradition, witches have always been this like negative, like old, ugly, like whatever, female figure. But there are a lot of work that is being done by like artists, activists, etc. that thinks about them witches as powerful figures, like doing kind of witchcraft, etc. And so I really wanted to find a version of it that was not necessarily like used in this context, that was our relationship to these figures. So Jen or like Jeannie, growing up in Iran, we all grew up with like stories about Jen. Like my grandmother would always tell me stories. People would always talk about Jen being in like public bath or like specific places. And I don't know again like how much some of you might know, but Jinn is actually talked about in the Quran. So there's angels obey, devils disobey, humans, which can obey or disobey, and Jinn. Jinn is actually the only figure that has the power to obey or disobey. It can be your friend, or it can come and like possess you. And that bluer space between these two ways of being was something that I was like really interested in because I saw so much potential. And also again through this embracing the monstrosity, turning around power structures, and refiguring these figures in that sense.
And just before we go to questions, you're playing around with routers. Explain why you found routers as your route to art. Explain what the project is.
So the project is, we're talking about the last project I discussed, the project that sort of rethinks routers and manipulates them. I think the way that we think about digital technologies is very narrow and very specific. We never turn them off. We expect them to always be really consistent. We think about them as completely having no relationship to the material world, and yet they are so contingent on the environment. And the energy footprint of the internet is now immense and growing. These systems are very much grounded in Earth. And so that project is very much trying to bring that relationship into the actual experience of interacting with the network itself. The ironic exhibition.
Well, let's open up this discussion to the room. I know we have some roving mics. And so comments or questions? Just raise your hand. There we go.
Hey, Tega. So the question actually is for both of you as teachers. I'm interested in what you're learning now from your students, how your students are maybe inspiring or shaping your own practice, and what some of the directions that they're moving in that you find particularly interesting.
That's a great question. I find as over the years of teaching, your relationships with your students change a lot, obviously. The folks I'm teaching at the moment are probably 20, 21. And so they really are a generation that doesn't really remember life before the internet. And I think one of the things that I'm grappling with in my practice, as you can see in the Bushwick Analytica project, is how do we meaningfully develop a literacy around these technologies that, you know, for someone born in the early 80s has seen that transformation from like broadcast media to algorithmic media now, where everything is personalized and curated in ways that are often really opaque. I can tell that to my students, but sometimes it feels like that's not even that relevant to them anymore, because this is the reality they're living in. And I mean, that Bushwick Analytica project is very much responding to conversations I've had to students around how we can better understand these technologies that we're dealing with.
Hi, good evening. I have a question for Amy, actually, that I thought for anyone to answer. Because I've heard you said go to where the silence is and say something in terms of journalism, and I was wondering how that manifests here. What is silent here?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I see our role as journalists to go to where the silence is. But so often, it's not actually quiet. You know, last night I was giving a talk about the standoff at Standing Rock, that remarkable unification of Native American tribes and First Nations in North Dakota in the midst of the presidential election in 2016, that the corporate media hardly covered. I mean, they hardly talked about Standing Rock, let alone the issue of climate change. And even just the language, I don't know if you heard, but The Guardian has just decided to change how they speak about climate change. They will no longer say global warming, they're going to say global heating. They're no longer going to use the term climate change, they're going to say climate catastrophe or climate crisis. But, you know, the indigenous communities have really been on the forefront of fighting for a sustainable planet. And the media hardly referred to what was happening there. It was critical that we go to where the silence is, but it wasn't silent. A massive, loud cacophony of voices. It just doesn't hit the corporate media radar screen. How do you experience that in both of your work? Well, the voices you're trying to bring out, like you said, the original voice, your grandmother.
I mean, like, I think I want to sort of like talk about something that I think about on like a daily basis. One thing that I tell my students also, but in general, I also like think about a lot is this idea of micro actions or macro influences, right? Often people think like you have to change the world, and the kind of work that you're doing, this project has to like have such big influence on everything. And I seriously never think about any project I do that way, because I really think about first my project as this like, you know, sort of like bodies of work that can sit together and then do certain things in different places. My lectures, my talks, you know, when I go and I don't only talk about my practice, but I also like talk about a lot of other concepts around that practice. But also on your daily life, like literally anyone can do this. You don't have to like be like an activist or an artist or have any kind of skill set, which is that, you know, let's say you get invited or like you see a panel or whatever that is white male only panel, right? I mean, if I get invited and I see that list, I usually email back and say, you know, can I ask why you make those choices? Like, what is it that like caused this? And you don't know how many have like heard the answer for this conversation with people that are like, oh, we couldn't really find any like enough, or like women of color were in AI, or like they were not available, the ones that we reached out. And you know, so there are a bunch of people who like made lists now of like women of color in these fields of like, let's say, technologies that are usually invisible. And then, you know, we send them those links and be like, hey, look up here, we have this list. There are actually a lot of people, and you can like reach out to them. So the silent is not just, this like one big thing that you have to go and make a big change. These things can be little actions we do on a daily basis, and there's a lot of them, And I think it's about that. I think it's about just like thinking about how a very like small tweaks can have influence, and it has changed. I mean, I think about like 6 years, 7 years ago when first we were discussing these like white-only panels and things like that, and everyone was like, "What's the problem with that?" Like they just got chosen because of their skills, and we're like, "No, but come on, like look at the history, look at these statistics, like what is happening, like what there." I don't remember the exact statistics. The numbers. So I'm not gonna say it, but there is like over like 70% of like MFA students in the arts departments are like women. But then when you think about solo shows for artists in galleries, over like 80% of them, even maybe 90, I don't know, are men. It's like really huge gap there. Like what happens in this space in between? So those are very little things, and I think we can question people, and we can sort of poke at things, and we can make things uncomfortable sometimes in a respectful way. But yes, those are ways that we can approach it perhaps.
I think I've approached that question in my work that sort of attempts to respond to particular strands or narratives in coming from the Silicon Valley or coming from the sort of industry of those in the business of building digital technologies. And I think that's a role that artists are really important for playing, is sort of troubling those narratives and pointing out other ways of viewing the world. You mentioned Musk before. Jeff Bezos gave a 1-hour lecture last week about how he was going to build a road to the moon, because otherwise we face a future of rationing. And basically, I think going to the moon is his answer to saving capitalism or maintaining economic growth in some way. So it became really obvious to me that there's no imagination in this group of people outside of this economic system we're living in. And that's a role that I think that those of us in the arts and humanities really are working through, is like, how do we build different lives that are based on different values, and to try to also look, through the tech, the layer of tech that is sitting on top of just an old political system. They're not new narratives.
So how do you then, using modern day technology, break down those old hierarchies and challenge capitalism?
That's a great question.
You set it up. It's your fault.
I think choosing to not work in industry and choosing to work as an artist, which can be very difficult and where a career path isn't always clear, is a way of trying to build a life on a different set of values. So that's a very personal response for me, of looking for other ways of building community and meeting that isn't contingent on great amounts of money or like material wealth or these types of things. And I think that's why it's really heartening when we see institutions make decisions about donors based on value sets, because those donors want those relationships for the cultural capital that those institutions offer. So that's a point of power that we have to exercise. We also just need taxes, right? The reasons why these individuals have so much money and have so much leverage is because we haven't paid attention to that part of the story too. So I think there are answers to that question.
You saw another hand right over there.
I had a question.
Please stand up.
I had a question kind of similarly to the point that you brought up, which is I think it's two different schools of thought, a little bit around working from the inside and choosing another path. And I've kind of been curious what your thoughts would be, Tega, someone who wanted to come from a positive place of hoping to influence change from the inside. Do you still have optimism about that idea, or do you kind of think that to speak any truth to these power structures, you kind of do have to be willing to challenge them from the outside?
I think we need both. I'm really excited and inspired about the organising that I've seen happen in spaces like Google and some of these tech companies. I think we're now seeing some pushback as Google has been pushing back against some of those organisers too, but I think that work is really fantastic, and it's also been amazing to see the change even in language around how technology workers are seeing themselves. And that's something that, is very recent. So I think both have a role to play, and obviously we make decisions about what paths we all take for lots of different reasons. But absolutely, I think working inside these companies, again, is you have a lot of power. There's a lot of opportunities to take these tiny little steps and little decisions to try to address some of these challenges.
Even I think I did a residency at Autodesk at Pier 9 for like a year when I was working on material speculation ISIS. And I always say if I was not there, I don't know if I could ever finish this work. You know, I was obviously the weirdo, like no one understood what I was like working on, or like I wouldn't like even like, I would just be on this corner like using 3D printers and like cleaning it and like, you know, polishing my prints. At the same time, like anytime we had meetings, I would be like, I think we need like more critical dialogue about, you know, the residency program, this, that, and they were actually very like open to it, at least the program at that time. I mean, now it doesn't exist anymore, it was just too good to be true. But they gave me so much resources and access, and, you know, it was fully paid, and I had access to all the machines and material. I mean, each of these pieces are printed in resin, which if you might know about 3D printing, is very expensive. There's no way I had like $1,500 to put in there for like printing each of these like pieces, right? I had to like apply for grants, and who knew how long that would take. So really, it played such an important role in like being there and making this work. So I think one way that I think about it is that unless it's like a case like, you know, what you were talking about with like Guggenheim and Whitney, which then you have to like really like figure out where you stand with a problem like that. It's also important to participate, or like find ways to participate in wealth. And this is something that a lot of, I think, people of color, immigrants, especially like in my conversation with a lot of like Black people, like they talk about like how wealth is something that is always like has been in the hand of the white demographics for so long. And by turning your sort of head away from like capitalism being like it's bad, you actually only continue to exist outside of that system, right? So this is for me also recent, like the last maybe 3-4 years of practice. I'm like, I am actually like very specific about what lectures I say yes to based on how much they can pay for my time, right? And before I used to be ashamed of it, but now I'm like, you know, fuck no. Like my time has to worth the equal to this other person that I know is getting paid that much, and I won't do this participation or this talk if it's like not paying for time and my like knowledge of like whatever. So that's also like ways to think about it. So those are two like contradictions of like thinking about being in these like systems and making those choices.
I had a question about your the artifacts creation and remodeling. Did you remodel the artifacts at the point in time in which they were destroyed, or did you remodel them as like they were presented in the ancient times? Is that old like art restoration debate where it's like if you restore an art piece to its former glory, or do you keep marks on the piece because it's part of history and stories? I was wondering what your
I sort of like focus on basically the last images of like what was available from them, right? So if let's say one of the pieces was like missing a nose because that's how it was destroyed, I like focus on that. Like I represented it or like reconstructed it based on how it looked like at the very time that it was destroyed. Which was like a really complicated choice because at some point I was like, well, if I'm reconstructing it, maybe I can also like, you know, in this image it shows that the nose is there, so maybe I can reconstruct it with that. But then since I was like really focused on this like destruction and then reconstruction from that point, I just decided to stay with the last image.
Tega, can you talk about robots in museums?
Robots in museums.
The use of robots, that use of artificial intelligence. I mean, when I was preparing for this, my mind was just blown. I hadn't known about any of these things, but the way people interact in museums and the way you're trying to make them more relevant today, so that they're not these static places where you're passive and just taking in. But one of the articles I was reading was about each museum, including the new museum, using robots, artificial intelligence, enhancing the museum experience and what you think of that and the kind of information that museums are getting from you as you roll up to these little bots.
I'm not actually familiar specifically with what the new museum is doing, but I think you're talking about the data that's collected from you when you're in the museum experience.
Also,
By the apps, by the digital footprint in the spaces and whatnot. I mean, I think it's a conversation around, again, surveillance technologies. And I don't think that just because one is an art institution, it sort of takes you out of that debate. I mean, if we look online, the reasons and the justifications that a lot of data is collected from us, you know, a lot of the entities who are doing this is like, oh, well, it makes your experience more personal, it shows you the content you want, and I'm imagining that the museums are making the same sorts of arguments, right? That it's going to create a richer experience that can be sort of customized. And so there's a trade-off here, right? This question of personalization versus data collection.
well, let me just read you the first paragraph of the Times.
Okay.
This year, 3 Washington-based museums at the Smithsonian deployed a half dozen 4 feet tall humanoid robots nicknamed Pepper to answer visitors' questions and tell stories using voice, gestures, and an interactive touchscreen. They also dance, play games, and pose for selfies. And the director of the Smithsonian's Arts and Industries building, overseer of the robots deployment, said she was blown away by visitors' reaction to them. She said it's a playful, joyful human experience.
I can't wait to see that. But it is interesting how we put robots into positions that one would, like, with their use in airports is sort of like welcoming devices, machines. We're trying to substitute robots in to do emotional labour that would have once been done by, I guess, a museum worker. And it's novel, but I think there's a whole lot of really complicated issues that come up with that. And there's a question then of like, who do we want to be doing that work, and what sort of future are we looking for if we are going to sort of automate a lot of those gestures and reduce the kind of like human interaction opportunities. Just last week, I think Uber introduced a feature that allowed you to request a silent ride so that the driver can't actually talk to you. And so there's this sort of like logic at work here where we are trying to kind of reduce the thorny, sometimes delightful, sometimes amazing friction between us in the world, which I think means we lose a lot. So I have to say I'm skeptic about the robots in the museum.
Can we have a last question?
So, I mean, you're constantly, this question probably is for both, you're constantly negotiating among activism, teaching, research, art pieces, career, but ideally, what would be like the legacy that you both would like to leave?
I want to be a detective. I told this to my partner all the time, I'm like, if I wasn't an artist, I would be a detective. But I think eventually I start to understand that that's actually what I do in my art. I am some kind of detective, especially when I was like doing this like research recently on it's like digital colonialism thing. I was like watching everyone's like interviews and contacting people. Like literally sometimes I feel like, you know, maybe that's journalism also, you know, but I do like to like think about it, and I'm like, okay, I'm like looking for the criminal, like what's happening here, you know. But it's legacy thing. I think about that often, and then I'm like, I don't want to actually think about that, because I want to focus really, instead of like focusing on the destination, like really focusing on the path. I just saw this exhibition of Frida Kahlo, which was on at Brooklyn Museum. And it was really fascinating to actually like see finally all of her work at like one place, because I hadn't had a chance to do that. I've always seen her work here and there online, etc. And really like, I mean, I don't know how much she knew that like 50 years later she'll be actually way more famous than her husband, and way more famous than so many other like artists of her time, right, or her past. So I'm like, I want to imagine that she actually didn't think about it. She just did the work that she was doing and really focused on that, and that's all that mattered.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think about it that much either. I think the work I decided to choose to work on is quite intuitive thing. It's driven by curiosity and sort of a desire to inject a kind of like poetics into a conversation around that's usually very instrumental. You know, when you talk about modern technology, it's usually you hear the engineering narrative so strongly, right? And I hear it from my students, you hear it in the press. And so I'm, I guess, driven by trying to change that, trying to find other ways to think about the systems. I think if I'm like, again, like if I'm waking up and I'm excited about the work, and that's why I'm doing it, rather than thinking about what might be left behind.
Well, I think Morehshin and Tega will love to talk to you afterwards. I also want to thank the two interpreters who were here, the sign language interpreter and the remarkably accurate, you have to write this now, miraculously accurate, it really is phenomenal. And I want to thank these two women who are here.
For being here tonight. It was really a treat. Thank you. If you'd like to learn more about our upcoming programming, I invite you to visit the Creative Time website. There you will find more information about our next discussion in this series, taking place on June 25th, Speaking Truth, Economics and Sovereignty, with Andrea Carlson, Zena Sarawiwa, and moderated by Gregory Gillette at Abrams Art Center. Thank you, Morehshin. Thank you, Tega. And thank you, Amy, for your thoughtful reflections tonight and your unbelievable generosity.
And folks, for a continuation of all kinds of conversations, check out Democracy Now!
Tonight, I know quite a few of us are going to be heading to Kings County Distillery on Sand Street, which is about a 7-minute walk from here. And I'd also like to share that we currently have a live Kickstarter to support our inaugural Emerging Artist Program with Risa Puno. For her project, Risa is creating an escape room that addresses issues of inequity and privilege, and it's slated to premiere this summer. Your contribution will help extend the run of the project and bring it to a wider audience. We are endlessly grateful for your support. And thank you so much for being here again tonight.